You watch someone walk into a room and every head turns without anyone deciding to look. You watch someone else say something perfectly reasonable in a meeting and it lands with a thud, forgotten before the next sentence starts. You've rehearsed a story in your head, funny, well-structured, and when you finally tell it out loud, it just sits there. You've met people who can make ordering coffee sound like an event. You've watched a stranger hold a table of 10 in total silence with nothing but the way they talk. Why does the exact same sentence land like electricity from one person's mouth and like static from another's? Why does confidence seem to come so easily to some people and never quite arrive for you? Most people answer this by deciding charisma is a birthright. You either have the gift or you don't, and no amount of effort closes that gap. That explanation feels true because it's simple, and it is almost entirely wrong. A researcher named John Antonakis spent years studying charismatic leaders under laboratory conditions, and what he found dismantles the whole idea of the natural. Charisma, his research shows, is not a trait. It's a skill made of specific, learnable, repeatable tactics. Over the next few minutes, you'll see exactly what those tactics are, why some people stumbled into them by accident and others were trained out of using them, and what happens the moment you start deploying them on purpose. For most of the 20th century, charisma was treated as something close to magic, an inborn quality some leaders simply radiated, impossible to define, and even harder to teach. Antonakis rejected that framing outright. Working with executives, students, and political leaders, he and his colleagues did something almost nobody had done before. They broke charisma down into its component parts, coded them, and tested whether teaching those parts to ordinary people actually made them more charismatic. It did. He called the result charismatic leadership tactics, a specific set of verbal and nonverbal behaviors that, used deliberately, produce the effect people describe as magnetic presence. As Antonakis put it, charisma can be trained. It's like a martial art. That single sentence quietly ends the debate. A black belt isn't a genetic gift. It's the accumulation of specific movements, practiced until they look effortless. Picture two students prepping for the same class presentation. One spends the week polishing facts and data, convinced that if the content is strong enough, the delivery will take care of itself. The other spends the same week doing something different, practicing a story that frames the data, rehearsing a pause before the key statistic, deciding in advance where to raise her voice. Both walk in equally prepared on substance. Only one walks out remembered. You may recognize yourself in the first student far more often than you'd like to admit. Someone who assumed being right would be enough, and quietly noticed it never quite was. That assumption isn't a personal failure. It's just missing information, the same information Antonakis spent his career trying to make explicit. What makes this finding so unusual is how it was tested. Antonakis didn't just observe naturally charismatic people and describe what he saw the way earlier researchers had. He ran controlled experiments, teaching randomly assigned participants the specific tactics and then measuring, with independent raters who had no idea who'd been trained, whether their perceived charisma actually rose. It did, consistently, across different groups and different settings. That detail matters because it rules out the obvious objection that the trained group simply happened to be more naturally gifted to begin with. Randomization erases that explanation. What's left is a skill, responding to instruction the way skills do. This is worth sitting with, because it quietly rewrites a story you've probably told yourself for years. If charisma were fixed at birth, no amount of preparation would have mattered for that first student polishing her data. But it isn't fixed, which means every flat presentation, every joke that landed wrong, every story that fell apart in the telling was never proof of a permanent shortage. It was proof of an untrained skill, which is an entirely different and far more useful thing to know. And once you see charisma as a toolkit instead of a trait, the next question becomes obvious. What, specifically, is in the toolkit? Antonakis' research identified a cluster of verbal tactics that show up again and again in people others describe as magnetic. Metaphors and analogies that make an abstract idea suddenly physical. Stories instead of statistics. Rhetorical questions that pull the listener into answering along with you. Moral conviction, stated plainly, instead of hedged with qualifiers. Contrasts this, not that used to sharpen a point until it can't be missed. None of these are personality traits. They're sentence-level choices, available to anyone willing to use them. Consider the difference between two ways of making the identical point. One person says, our team needs to improve communication, because right now, information isn't flowing well between departments. Technically accurate, instantly forgettable. Another person says, right now, half this company doesn't know what the other half is building until it's too late to help. Same underlying message. One version uses a contrast and a vivid image. The other uses a committee memo. Antonakis' studies found that speakers trained to swap the second style for the first were rated as significantly more charismatic by listeners who had no idea any training had occurred. The content hadn't changed, only the shape of the language carrying it. You've likely felt the difference from the listening side without ever naming it. A speech that used a single well-placed metaphor stayed with you for years, while a technically flawless briefing evaporated by lunchtime. That's not because your memory failed. It's because one speaker gave your brain something to hold on to, and the other didn't. There's a reason these specific devices work, and it isn't decoration. A metaphor forces an abstract idea into a shape the brain already has stored. You don't have to build a new mental file. You just attach the new information to one that already exists. A rhetorical question does something similar with attention. The moment a question is asked, even silently, the listener's mind starts generating an answer, which means they're no longer passively receiving the sentence, they're participating in it. Antonakis' coding scheme treats these as separate, countable tactics precisely because each one does a distinct piece of cognitive work, not because they simply sound nice together. This is why swapping one dry sentence for one well-built contrast can move the needle more than doubling the length of a talk. It isn't about saying more. It's about giving the listener's mind something to do with what you say. Once you notice how much of charisma lives in these specific verbal habits, the second layer becomes impossible to ignore, because words are only half of what's actually happening when someone holds a room. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Charisma isn't only carried in sentences. Antonakis' coding scheme also tracks nonverbal tactics, animated voice tone, purposeful gesture, facial expressiveness, and direct eye contact, and these often register before a single word has been consciously processed. Listeners form an impression of warmth, confidence, or trustworthiness within seconds, largely from tone and posture, well before the content of the sentence has caught up. Think of a flat monotone delivering brilliant advice versus an animated voice delivering something ordinary. The room remembers the second, almost every time, even if a transcript would show the first speaker said something more useful. This isn't shallow or unfair the way it first sounds. It's a real and measurable feature of how humans process spoken language. Wired long before written language existed. Tone was the original information channel. Content came later. Picture two managers announcing the exact same policy change to their teams. One reads from a slide in a level, careful voice, eyes mostly on the screen. The other stands, makes eye contact around the room, lets her voice rise slightly at the part that actually matters, and pauses before the key sentence instead of rushing through it. Antonakis' research would predict, correctly, that employees rate the second manager as more trustworthy and more competent, despite delivering identical information. Not because the words were better, but because the body around the words was doing its job. You may recognize this gap in yourself the next time you feel unheard in a conversation you know you handled correctly. The facts were right. The point was fair. And it still didn't land. Because the delivery around the facts was flat, where the moment called for animation. It helps to understand why the timing works this way. Tone of voice and facial expression are processed by older, faster circuitry than language is. Your brain has been reading vocal pitch and posture for far longer, evolutionarily speaking, than it's been parsing grammar. That means a listener's gut sense of whether to trust you often forms before your sentence has even finished, built entirely from how you sound and how you're standing, rather than what you're actually saying. Antonakis' nonverbal tactics, the raised eyebrow at the right moment, the voice that drops for emphasis instead of staying level, are simply working with that older circuitry instead of against it. This is uncomfortable to hear, because it suggests something you've likely felt but never confirmed. Substance was never the whole game, and the next part of the picture explains exactly why some people never got the memo. Here is where the pattern splits in an interesting direction, because the gap in charisma doesn't only show up as too little expression. It shows up in excess just as often, and both versions come from the same underlying place. Consider two co-workers at the same networking event. The first stands at the edge of the room, speaks quietly when spoken to, gives short, careful answers, and leaves early, convinced afterward that she's just not a people person. The second works the room loudly, talks over pauses, fills every silence with another story, and leaves feeling like the night went great, while most of the room quietly found him exhausting. Neither one is using the tactics Antonakis identified. One is under-expressing out of caution. The other is over-expressing out of a different kind of anxiety, mistaking volume and quantity for the animation and conviction that actually produce charisma. Both of them, in other words, are missing the actual mechanism, just from opposite directions. The quiet one has the raw material. She may have excellent stories, sharp insight, real conviction, but delivers it with none of the tonal variation or framing that would let it land. The loud one has plenty of energy, but no shape to it, no restraint, no well-placed pause, which is often what separates charismatic delivery from simple noise. Antonakis' data consistently shows that charisma correlates with skillful, well-timed use of these tactics, not with sheer frequency of talking or forcefulness of presence. You may see yourself somewhere on this same line, closer to one edge or the other, and it's worth locating yourself honestly, because the fix is different depending on which direction you lean. Underuse needs volume and framing added. Overuse needs restraint and timing added. It's worth being precise about why the loud version fails just as often as the quiet one, because it isn't obvious at first. More talking should, in theory, give someone more chances to land a good point. But Antonakis' ratings consistently show that raw talk time has almost no relationship to perceived charisma on its own. What predicts it is the density of actual tactics used, the metaphors, the pauses, the contrasts per minute of speech, not the minutes themselves. A person who talks constantly but never varies their pace or leaves room for a point to breathe is, statistically, doing the same thing as the quiet person who never opens their mouth. Neither one is deploying the toolkit. They're just failing to deploy it in opposite directions, one through absence and one through noise. Both are correctable, once you can see which side of the line you're actually standing on, which brings up the question of where this gap even comes from in the first place. It's worth saying plainly what this whole pattern is, because the reframe changes how you're allowed to feel about it. A gap in charismatic delivery isn't a defect in your personality. It's a learned pattern, shaped early, usually by whether expressiveness was rewarded or punished in the environment you grew up in. A child who gestures wildly while telling a story and gets laughed at warmly, encouraged to keep going, learns that animation is safe and rewarded. A child who does the exact same thing and gets told to quiet down, to stop being dramatic, to speak when spoken to, learns the opposite lesson just as thoroughly and carries a flattened, cautious delivery style into adulthood without ever consciously choosing it. Neither child was born with more or less natural charisma. Both were trained, by their environment, into the delivery style they now think of as simply who they are. This matters because it means the flat voice, the hedged sentence, the reluctance to pause for effect isn't evidence of a missing gift. It's evidence of an old adaptation to a specific environment, one that likely made sense at the time and has simply outlived its usefulness. Antonakis' training studies make this point almost by accident. Adults who had spent decades believing they were just not the charismatic type showed measurable, significant increases in rated charisma after a matter of hours of targeted practice. That timeline only makes sense if the underlying capacity was there all along, buried under a habit rather than absent from the wiring. You may recognize the shape of your own early training in this, a specific memory of being told to tone it down, to stop showing off, to be less much sitting quietly underneath a communication style you've spent years assuming was simply your personality. It wasn't. The same logic runs in the other direction for the overexpressive case. A child who only got attention in a loud, crowded household by talking louder and faster than everyone else learns, just as durably. That volume and speed are what get you noticed and carries that strategy into rooms, years later, where it no longer serves the same purpose, where restraint would actually land better than force. In both cases, the adult behavior makes complete sense once you know the environment that shaped it. Neither one is a personality. Both are solutions to a problem that no longer exists in the same form. It was a strategy that once kept you safe or approved of, and strategies, unlike traits, can be revised once you know their strategies. Which leads directly to the only question that actually matters now. If charisma is a set of tactics rather than an identity, then improving at it looks less like self-transformation and more like rehearsal, closer to learning an instrument than confessing a flaw. Antonakis' own training programs followed a simple loop. Learn the specific tactic, practice it in a low-stakes setting, get direct feedback, repeat. Participants who went through this loop for even a short, structured period showed real, measurable gains, rated by strangers who had no idea training had taken place. The starting move isn't a personality overhaul. It's picking one tactic and over-practicing it until it stops feeling foreign. If you tend toward underexpression, that might mean deliberately building one metaphor into your next explanation instead of 6 qualifiers. If you tend toward overexpression, it might mean building in one deliberate pause before your key point instead of rushing to fill it. Small, specific, testable the same way a martial artist doesn't learn every move at once, but drills a single strike until the body no longer has to think about it. Picture the version of you a year from now who has quietly run this loop a few dozen times, noticed the sentence that landed, noticed the story that didn't, adjusted, tried again. That person isn't a different personality. They're the same person with a larger toolkit, deploying the same conviction you already have, just with a shape other people can actually receive it in. You were never missing the gift. You were missing the instruction manual, and now you have the outline of one. The next time you feel a sentence sitting flat in a room, don't ask what's wrong with you, ask which tactic was missing, and try the room again with it in place. If you want to test any of this against your own life, you don't need to take anyone's word for it. Record yourself in your next real conversation, listen back once, and look for exactly one thing, where the pause could have gone, or where the flat line could have had a shape. The evidence is already sitting in how you talk every day. It's simply never been examined before.